So, what events in your own history led you to become a behavior analyst?
Well, it was just an accident of where I went to college, I think, to some degree. I received a scholarship for the son of an Illinois high school teacher, which resulted in my going to Hamilton College, because that's the place that offered the scholarship. And it turned out that the psychology department there was substantially students of Keller and Schoenfeld. So Bill Stebbins and George Geiss were my primary teachers there. I hardly knew what psychology was before taking that, and so for me, taking the basic course, which was the Keller and Schoenfeld type laboratory with coordinated experiments and lab reports, and learning to talk this way and write this way, just seemed very, very logical to me. And in fact, when I went to the library and I found that all of the books in psychology were under BF, that seemed perfectly logical to me, that it should be that way. But for me then, as I was learning to speak the language of behavior analysis, I've really felt I was learning labels for relationships I already understood. It was sort of like when I took a course in music theory, having played the piano since the age of 5, I was just learning names for relationships that I could already hear and even produce myself. And behavioral principles seemed the same way for me. And I was actually a little perplexed by the fact that the course itself was not considered easy by most students, and yet for me I only read each thing once. I didn't have to read it twice. So that sort of contributed to it. Also, there was a really tight-knit group of psych majors, and most of them went on to graduate school, and some of them are names that you would know. So all of that, I think, contributed. I wish I knew, though, what it is that brings a person to be prepared to understand it as an integral way of thinking and interpreting behavior, because clearly not everybody finds it obvious. So I guess that's about as much as I can say about that. The next question.
So, how were you trained as a behavior analyst?
Well, it started then, first working with each student with his own individual laboratory rat. Along with this, of course, this is before online computers, and so we learned relay programming, and this induced actually a very systematic way of understanding environments as defined by behavior or as it interacts with behavior. And so just the power of being able to arrange the contingencies, I think, contributed to it. Then doing an independent study as a senior in college led to it also. And then by that time, of course, graduate school was next, and I was faced with the decision of should it be Harvard or should it be Columbia? And I thought long and hard about that and visited the two places. And in Columbia, it was very clear that you were pretty certain to get your degree, but it might take forever. And to find space for research, you would have to attach yourself to a particular faculty member, because space was just not available for a student working independently. Harvard, in contrast, was much more examination-oriented, but it wouldn't take as long, and they would support pretty much whatever you chose to do. And so I went the Harvard route. I think one thing that influenced it also was I visited Columbia on a February day when it was really nasty weather and everybody walked around looking at their feet. Whereas when I visited Harvard, people came out of buildings arguing with each other, and that ambiance, I think, made a difference as well. At Harvard, again, I had a really strong interactions with people, again, who turned out to be fairly prominent. Howard Racklin, Alan Nuringer, John Staden, among others. And we learned as much from each other, I think, as we did from the faculty members. But this, again, was it was really a community of people who were working very constructively with each other. We certainly competed in some ways, but the a lot of the threads that have become, sort of major themes within basic research could be seen even in that early work. So that was sort of what got me on my way.
Excellent. So what was the field like back in the early days?
Well, we did not have the sense, what shall we say, we didn't have the broader integrated community, I think, that we have now as we do, having ABA and all the regional organizations and so forth. There was plenty of enthusiasm, and of course the myth is that behavior analysis, or Skinner's psychology, dominated psychology back in those days, but it did not. It was always a somewhat insular group within psychology. That actually led to some of my later work, is what is it that's special and different about this language, and how this way of interpreting behavior differs from the rest of the culture. We'll get into that later probably. So for example, in the famous Chomsky and Skinner controversy, there was no organization that could mobilize some kind of reaction to a situation like that, because there's a lot of misinformation spread about Skinnerian psychology at that time. At the same time, to a large extent, we didn't care, because we could do good experiments, and we found we were discovering orderly relationships. We could, in a sense, we were quite confident, do at least as good a science, if not better than that of other areas. At the same time, I don't think we generally recognized, even though Skinner had asserted that his approach really was of a piece with biology, I don't think we really recognized that as much. Reason for that is, within psychology, if you take a biological approach, the assumption is that you are then explaining behavior in terms of brain function, whereas that wasn't what we were doing very clearly. What I came to understand later was that yes, we link up with biology in some of the explanatory concepts, because population biology and the notion of selection, etc., are concepts that are interpretive within biology, and thus selection is an interpretive concept within behavior analysis. So you can link with the natural sciences and with the biology without having to do it the way other people might think you should. But all of those were issues that most of us hadn't even thought about yet. We were just chasing the data and doing our best to do good experiments. Another thing was, early on, even though Skinner had written the book on verbal behavior, most of us, I think, thought of verbal behavior as often kind of irrelevant. In fact, one thing that got me interested in psychology was, and behavior analysis in particular, was I was fascinated that really smart people do really stupid things. And if you take the vernacular, or the ordinary language conception of intelligence, that smart people should do stupid things less often, and instead we find smart people do things on a more colossal scale than the less intelligent people. Although sometimes if you put a less intelligent person in a certain position, as our current president of the United States, they can produce quite a bit of mischief too. And so this is with hindsight, of course. I think that approach of not putting as much emphasis on verbal functioning makes sense, but for a little bit different reason, and that is most psychologies and the language of our culture suggests that verbal functioning is primary. So you have basically Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," and then you sort of develop your worldview and your philosophical position from that. From the point of view of behavior analysis, there is a lot of functioning. A lot of it is very, very subtle and complex, which is simply direct transaction with the world. So it's not what shall we say, anti-verbal in some sense. It's just non-verbal. And so this is, of course, much of what we share with members of other species. And we're sensitive to things like frequency of reinforcement as well as the immediate and direct contingencies. And then on top of that, then you have a verbal overlay. And as we now understand pretty well, you have the contingencies of acquisition of verbal behavior and even of stating of rules, which is then verbal behavior in relation to nonverbal behavior, but then you have even the skill of acting in ways that bring those two into correspondence, but that cannot be taken for granted. And so then the verbal functioning is an overlay on this complex dynamic of things that we do directly. The rest of psychology has sort of caught up with that a little bit over the years, because now they talk about implicit knowledge as opposed to explicit knowledge, and implicit rules, implicit as attitudes, explicit attitudes. Well, the implicit part is what we were studying all along. And I think within psychology, even now, psychology at large, the implicit part is still the kind of mysterious, it's the troll under the bridge kind of. And whereas for us it's basic, normal biological functioning, it's easier to actually study the non-verbal in many respects than it is to study the verbal. But back then, it was basically, we just kind of swept the verbal part aside because we saw the direct control of contingency as being very important. So that's something that's evolved over time.
So you mentioned parallels between biology and behavior analysis. When do you think the idea of operant conditioning as another selectionist mode first started to take hold?
Well, I mean, Skinner sort of objected when people proposed that this is a fairly recent emphasis. He argued that it was there early on. And it's true, even one of the reviews of Skinner's 1938 book complained that Skinner took biology more seriously than he took the rest of psychology. But I think it was only really at the time, about when he wrote the article, it appeared in Science magazine, Selection by Consequences, I think that most of us really started thinking about selection as a causal mode. And for my own part, by that time I was thinking in terms of explanatory language, partly puzzled over why some people have such difficulty with it. And if you look at even the Aristotelian notions of cause, you have efficient cause, final cause, etc., that explanatory language is couched as efficient cause. Cause-effect implies efficient cause. Final cause, I mean, for a lot of us, that seems final cause, that means future events cause present events. That's nonsense. But in fact, final cause is in its configuration like selection by consequences. And if you're going to talk about final cause, what you're saying is you're understanding what you're seeing right now before you in terms of where it winds up. And yet that implies it's sort of like, understanding sunset as well. You've seen a lot of them, and you've seen what came before and what came after. And so too, to understand reinforcement, you have to understand the extended scale. And so the reinforcement process, even though we think of immediacy of reinforcement as occurring at the moment when the reinforcer occurs, in fact, you don't understand it as process until you understand it as extended in time. And that's something I came to somewhat more slowly, but I think it's of a piece with understanding then selection is, yes, you could say there is an event that is especially salient in the selection, and yet you don't understand it as process until you understand the selected entity as something spread out over time. And so I would put it, if there's a particular point of recognition, it was probably with that article by Skinner, even though certainly there was plenty there you could go back and find that was earlier. And I think more people started talking about it that way at that point.
So, what do you think your most important contributions to behavior analysis are, or what do you want to be remembered for?
Well, people often want to identify the work I did on avoidance, and I think that's important because it really showed that the traditional way of approaching avoidance was rather misguided. The notion of what reinforces avoidance, because avoidance means something didn't happen, so how can something not happening control behavior? Once again, you have to then understand avoidance as a process over time. I think in terms of basic research and basic questions, then, it would be the recognition that avoidance is not a different category, but it really concerns the issue of multiple scales of analysis or a process going on at the same time. We still have some, although I think it's finally sort of damped down, arguments between those who strongly prefer the molecular and want to then put together the molar by adding together or concatenating the molecular processes, as opposed to seeing molar process occurring at its own scale. And so, to the extent that I think I've helped people to understand that you can have processes going on simultaneously at multiple scales and multiple overlapping scales, I think that's a piece that I guess I would want to be recognized. I mean, you can understand it, we all understand it quite readily. If you look at some substance, let's say with a microscope, and you'll see one pattern at one scale, another pattern with a different lens at a different scale, yet another pattern at another scale, which is different from what you see with the naked eye. We don't assert that one level of organization disappeared just because we're looking with a different lens, and yet on time scales, that's the way people have tended to argue. You can have relationships at one level that just literally don't exist at other levels. Oh, I don't like the word exist because it sort of suggests thing-like kind of aspects. We're talking about dynamics that happen over time. But to stay with the metaphor of spatial things, you could make a triangle out of spaghetti. And spaghetti is fairly rigid, and a triangle has particular rigid characteristics. If you look, for example, at truss structures in roofs and bridges and whatnot, they have a lot of triangles in them. That's because the triangle is a stable shape. If you made it all out of rectangles, it could all go into parallelograms and then go flat. And so the triangular part is important. However, if you cook the spaghetti, you no longer have those properties of the triangle. On the other hand, you can examine molecularly or in terms of little pieces the difference between cooked and uncooked spaghetti, and that will tell you nothing about the difference between the triangle and the parallelogram. And so to get people to understand that same kind of difference on the time scale that we can have, you probably cannot violate the necessities of what's going on at the molecular level, but you cannot build the larger picture entirely on the basis of what you can learn from the molecular level. I think that kind of understanding is one piece of what I like to be known for. But then this other thing is that this puzzlement over why behavior analysis is so obvious to some people, not to others. How it is that Skinner was vilified. He was the puppeteer in the white coat who wanted to control everybody, and Skinner was really a very nice guy. In fact, he was nicer than most of the faculty in the department there at Harvard. So that led me into the nature of explanatory language, and I was puzzling over this. I remember the first talk I gave on it. It was in 1980, and this is the first talk I'd ever given that didn't have data, but it was purely interpretive. And by accident, I think, I'd given it the title, Our Dialect of Psychologies, and they had put it in a fairly large room right before the president's address, and Izzy Golddiamond was the president at the time. And so I was really nervous because I didn't have my slides to hide behind, but people really got caught on to what I was trying to say. So that really led to, I think, the other major thing that has characterized my work, and it's Skinner had complained about mentalism, of course, but what occurred to me was, well, mentalism is not a behavioral term. Mentalism is I'm not even sure it's a term within philosophy. But to a large extent, he engaged the arguments sort of in the arena of philosophy and the humanities. And that's sort of like trying to fight on somebody else's turf. And furthermore, it's not really, you're not understanding it in your own terms. And so if behavioral principles are relevant here, then I think we have to move on to a different way of getting at it. And so what to me seemed an entering wedge on it was that that explanatory talk is directional or bipolar. The direction aspect, you could say, is still kind of metaphorical, but it's bipolar: cause, effect, noun, verb, independent variable, dependent variable. It's no single one of those, because independent variable, dependent variable is two nouns rather than noun-verb. But if you get into the philosophical domain, it's agent, action, and talk about agency being with the person or the organism and so forth. Well, the phenomena that we're concerned with are what organisms do. So the doing has to be one part of it. Then there is the organism, and then there's the organism's circumstances. And you can construe those as just the immediate circumstances, or you can talk about it as the individual's history. So even though it's intrinsically tripolar, organism, environment, and behavior, you can't talk about it without privileging one or the other in the part that makes things happen, so to speak. So behaving is what you're accounting for, so you're either using organism-based terms like mood, brain, personality, you name it, or you are appealing and thus backgrounding the environment, or you're appealing to organism and the principles of behavior-environment interaction with organism as background. And the person who prefers the other kind of way of talking is going to feel like you're dissing them, essentially, and thus you get some of the heat of the arguments. In the domain of animal conditioning and learning, you find it then in the largely Pavlovian tradition of people wanting to talk about associations, and all of the research strategies are characterized around the nature of associations and so forth. Whereas then behavior analysts see that as kind of arcane and complicating things that don't matter very much in a way, or rather oddly framed questions. So we want to look at the dynamics of behavior in the free operant, where association would be pretty hard to pin down, and it's irrelevant anyway, kind of. And so then the associationists see that as hopelessly complicated, and why bother? So that's one example. The interesting thing is that one of my colleagues, hearing from students who were taking her courses as well as mine, Louise Kidder, gave me an article. She said, sounds to me, from what the student's saying, is you're talking about attribution theory. Well, it turns out in social psychology there is this whole domain that started, I guess in the 70s, in looking at, they would say, looking at the way ordinary folks, the man on the street, the college sophomore, explain behavior. And they talked about dispositional versus situational explanations. Aha, yes, that sounds like the very thing I was talking about. The curious thing about it, though, is that when I went to read that literature, some of it was pretty straightforward, and then other parts seemed kind of strange. That why did they do the experiment that way? And then I got it. First off, one of the first papers is Jones and Nisbet. It's called The Actor and the Observer. And their point is that in accounting for our own actions, we appeal to environmental circumstances. In accounting for someone else's, we tend to appeal to characteristics of the person. Okay. Then there's a person named Ross later who introduced the term called the fundamental attribution error. And that is the tendency to appeal to characteristics of the person even when there aren't identifiable environmental events, variables, if you like, that result in the behavior. I'm avoiding using the word cause. Well, if you go now back to Jones and Nisbet, actor and observer, we're giving an account that would be normal if it were from the viewpoint of the person whose behavior we're explaining, but we're giving it from the other viewpoint, and that's abnormal. And so that's one point. So we're violating a cultural convention in this way. Then the Ross's article on the fundamental attribution error included dozens, it was a long article, dozens of commitments of the fundamental attribution error, even while he was discussing it. At the same time, we speak both ways naturally. This is something my students have heard too many times, but I've done careful experiments with myself as subject, and I've discovered that Guinness is stronger than Budweiser. And I've done equally careful experiments with myself as subject, and I've discovered that I'm more allergic to tulips than I am to roses. Now, you probably didn't notice as this went by, Guinness stronger than Budweiser, two externals. The other, I am more allergic to tulips than I am to roses. Why are you sneezing? I have an allergy, right? But you see, my allergy is the potency of the tulip to make me sneeze. On the other hand, the potency of Guinness is my susceptibility to it. There's a known physiological mechanism in both cases, and yet we talk one way in one situation, the other way in the other. What occasions it? Now, I'm giving you an environment-based account of this, is if everyone is affected similarly, that occasions our speaking environment behavior. If people are idiosyncratic, then it is normal to appeal to characteristics of the person. Now, this leads to another interesting point here, and that is attribution theorists say that they are studying the man on the street, etc. In their very own articles, they suggest that scientific prose doesn't make that mistake, right? Now, first point, I would say in ordinary language, the so-called fundamental attribution error is not an error, usually. That is, if you work with somebody who can't be trusted to tell the truth, thinking them as a liar is very adaptive. You behave in particular ways, just appealing to their, or taking into account their liarhood, so to speak. On the other hand, if it's your child or your student and they're lying, thinking of them as a liar is no help at all. What are you going to do about it? You're going to excise their liarhood? You're going to drug them or what? Do brain surgery? No. So, in the domain that attribution theorists introduce the fundamental attribution error, it's not an error. However, in their own prose, where they claim it's not happening, they do it all the time. A recent study by Nisbet and some other people, Choi was the lead author, as I recall, on cross-cultural comparisons. Looking at Eastern Hindus, I believe it was, versus Americans, they found that the Eastern Hindus did not commit the fundamental attribution error, whereas Americans did in comparable experimental arrangements. That article begins with a discussion of the fundamental attribution error, and yet when they get around to explaining the difference, they talk about it in dispositional terms of the Hindu and dispositional terms of the Americans. So they're committing it themselves, even while discussing it. Okay. So, I guess part of what I hope comes to be recognized then is the difference between behavior analysis and other approaches then relates to our ways of talking, that relate to the manners in which we interpret, and it will always be counter to the surrounding culture. We're going to violate certain conventions, and people simply are not aware of what they're reacting to, but there's something not quite right about it, or not quite normal, and often people react to that sort of thing as threatening, even though they would not be able to tell you exactly what it is that's setting them off. Now, in terms of science, this plays out differently, because if you have an environment-based versus an organism-based account, both of them assume or acknowledge there's an immediate situation. But what I discovered with attribution theory, when they talk about situation, they're talking about what's there right now. If it's past, then it's really, it diverts to somehow the past situations as stored in the organism or something, okay? Whereas in the behavior analytic approach, we accept causal relations over time. You insulted me yesterday, I avoid you today. We don't have to talk about the insult being stored and then retrieved later. We just see that as a functional relation. And yes, of course, there's the issue of continuity over time, but no explanatory system handles everything. Another thing is the fundamental question is different depending on which account you have. For an organism-based account, what's fundamental is the question of how the organism does what it does. Thus, For organism-based theorists, if you're going to take a biological approach, you're interested in the brain and how the brain operates. On the other hand, in an environment-based account, the fundamental question is, what does the individual do under what circumstances? And then the what-whens get elaborated into a systematic account. The other, I think, major thing is the way time relations occur over time. That is, it's implicit, I think, in ordinary understanding and also in organism-based theorizing that the instant now is reality. And so you have the single neural impulse, etc. And so what's going on is a succession of slices of time of simultaneity. But if you ask, how small is that instant? If we're truly an infinitesimal instant, nothing's happening. And so that can't be it. So it's got to be a little wider. Well, how about the full width of a neural impulse, like 1,000th of a second? Well, it's probably going to be more than that. So how about a few of them? Well, if a few, why not a lot? So why not 5 seconds, 10 seconds? Well, if 10 seconds, why not 10 minutes? It's a continuum. What's changing is the way we talk about it. It's not anything fundamental that has changed about reality versus non-reality. And so the understanding that process as intrinsically extended in time, I think, is then another piece of this. So what I would hope to be remembered for then is an understanding of the relations between how we talk and how it differs from that of the culture at large, but how this also then is of a piece even with our conceptions of reality, and understanding then behavioral psychological process has to be understood as extended in time, and then the time relations can be simultaneously organized on multiple scales. So that's a lot to aspire to, but those are the things I've gotten into, and I think it leads to, I think, a much more sophisticated conception of what behavior analysis is, and I think we do need to be more sophisticated.
So do you think the behavior analytic way of talking about things will eventually extend into normative psychology?
Well, for the foreseeable future, I think there's a tension in it. I've gotten more involved in applied work, and especially the issues concerning autism. That's a separate story. As soon as you need to work with the parents or the teachers who need to carry out an intervention with a child, if you start right out with technical terms, they're probably not going to be able to handle it, and so you have to start closer to where they are, and then use a gradual approximation to move more and more toward incorporating the principles as accurately or precisely as possible, partly because they need to interrelate, and if they get imprecise, they don't interrelate as well. But at the same time, if you start out just teaching the principles, then they're not going to do very well on the procedures. On the other hand, if you start out too much, just, well, this is what you do, as soon as anything unexpected happens or the procedure isn't working very well, they'll say, well, we tried that and it didn't work, for one thing, or something happens, so they try to make an adjustment, but not understanding the principles involved, they basically adjust in an ineffective way. So you have this problem of, and I see it as a continuing problem, of working with how do you bring those two along together. And as I say, it's presumably we're not going to change the language of the culture entirely, because I think in some ways it is functional, as I pointed out earlier. But for us to somehow get everybody to talk the way we do, and that was basically what Skinner was trying to do. He was saying, okay, mentalism is untenable, so we shouldn't talk mentalistically, we should all talk behaviorally. And if he could have sort of somehow got the culture to adopt that, indeed, it would have changed everything. But I think he underestimated the degree to which those cultural patterns are there, and they're endemic. And so I think part of what we will achieve over the years will be, over the decades or whatever, will be learning ways to work with it, ways to state things that are behaviorally consistent, but yet that accommodate some of the cultural patterns more effectively. I can give you a couple examples. One's very simple and straightforward, although surprisingly people don't do it as much as you think they would, and that is to use the possessive. And so you reinforce the child's cooperative behavior. You don't reinforce the child for cooperating. Okay, and that's everybody who's BACB coordinated probably accredited probably understands why that should be. If you talk about reinforcing the child, then you've kind of lost track of the time relation and the contingency itself. But still, but another type of move is we do need to address phenomena that are that come out of ordinary language, and yet that are not behaviorally defined. And so how do you do that without buying them? And so things like, for example, the emotion terms, frustration, etc. Now, one problem is frustration is probably better construed as an ongoing phenomenon rather than as some state residing somewhere back behind the eyes. And so what do you want to do? I don't want to treat frustration as a state or as a brain state or as an entity that gets reified, but I want to address the issue. Well, there's a key phrase that I think that works, and that is when we speak of. So when we speak of frustration, then we're talking about situations where past behavior has been reinforced, the SDs for success are there, and yet success isn't occurring, or reinforcement isn't occurring, and that's the sort of situation in which we speak of frustration. Notice I didn't say frustration is nonsense, but I also didn't buy it as an explanatory concept. And so I think that when we speak of is a really handy locution. But I think we need a lot more of those. I find in working with beginning students or people new to behavior analysis, even though the possessive is within their repertoire, it doesn't violate ordinary language patterns, yet still it is difficult to get them to do it, or do it consistently. And yet, I think those are the kinds of moves that we need, and we need to find as many of those kinds of gambits, if you like. Just as in chess, you have gambits, patterns that sort of that work within a given situation. I think too, then verbally, we need to find those gambits that we would actually have as repertoires when working with people who are not familiar with the approach.
So, how do you think behavior analysis has changed over the years for your career?
Part of it is we take verbal behavior much more seriously now. We are doing much more research with humans. I think it's important that the work with non-humans continue, and yet even my own work, I think, has gone more and more in the domain of working with human behavior. It is harder to do good experiments. If you have it within a laboratory setting, you have then this problem of discriminating, that is your experimental subject, discriminating this as a laboratory as opposed to the rest of their world. On the other hand, if you then do experiments outside the laboratory, you have obviously other kinds of variables that intervene. Working with kids, you have problems of vacations and school terms and all the other things that staff changes, all the other things that can mess up an experiment. Also, working with sophisticated humans, the role of instructions is crucial, and yet we don't really have a principled way of sorting out the adjustments that need to be made to enable the experiment to work or to happen. Another problem in working with humans is if you really want to be doing behavioral work, I'm a skeptic with respect to just going with what has happened with too much of psychology, of getting people to tell you hypothetically what they would do in reaction to hypothetically described situations. To be sure, if you want to study delayed discounting and look at magnitude of the amounts of money involved, you can't, ask somebody in an experiment, or you can't directly expose them to, would you discount, $10,000 delay by 5 years because you're not going to live long enough to do the full experiment, because you're going to want to use lots of intervals and lots of times and repeat the experiment. So there are these practical aspects of it, and yet it's very clear that there's so much slippage between what people say they would do and what they actually do, and people's repertoires of rule following. The first time we introduced word processing within the research course, I remember it was back in the days of dual floppy machines, and so most of the students at this time didn't have computers at home, and so he said, okay, we're going to have to all do these things in exactly the same way at the same time, because we're talking about bootstrapping. You had a boot disk that went in one drive, and then your data disk that went in the other drive, and so this is how you hold a data disk, and then very carefully slide it into the drive, and so forth. Well, I found the first time we did this, these are college sophomores and juniors, one student slid the disk in between two disk drives. Others had gone on and done other things to where they, God knows what the machine was doing. We had to turn it off and start it over again. And these are intelligent adult people, and they can't follow simple single instructions especially when there are these contingencies that follow directly. They do something, the machine does something that just sort of takes off. Now it may not be doing anything functional, but it was doing, and they're behaving. So then you think about doing an experiment where you give instructions, and you're assuming then that they were following your instructions. Well, you better not assume that. And so at the same time, I think doing experiments with humans, research with humans, is very important. The next thing is you really want that research to involve genuine consequences. Well, now you have the problems of ethics and IRB committees that are there probably for good reason. And yet, once again, if you can only use ineffective consequences, there's a sense in which you're not studying real behavior, that at least not the behavior that you're most worried about. So I think still that's the direction we need to be going. We need to be finding better ways to do the research on human behavior as well as non-humans, and to do it with effective consequences, and address really some of the interesting and difficult questions. I'm involved in a symposium later at ABBA this year on the behavior of the listener. So we're concerned with verbal behavior, and I'm going to be arguing that we need to address, for example, narrative. And why? Well, if you look at it, we read novels. Furthermore, jokes are predicated upon the occurrence of narrative. Furthermore, if you read newspaper articles or magazine articles, almost always, even if it's a serious social problem of some kind, they introduce it with a narrative about a person who is in the situation that they're concerned about. I don't think it's just that that's taught in journalism school. I think, in fact, that's what, in fact, reinforces the behavior of reading, and in fact makes the article more effective. But what the hell is going on there? We don't have a behavioral account of narrative, really, except in sort of hand-waving terms. So I have some notions as to how to proceed. But I think we need to address those kinds of issues. Once again, narrative isn't a technical term, right? So when we speak of narrative, what are we talking about? Already that gives us a little bit of a distance, and now we can maybe begin to take it apart and analyze how it works.
So, is there anything in your career that you would do differently if you could?
Yes, there are a couple things. One was, and it's really an issue of time allocation, where I try to place a given article and so forth. Probably the most important one of these, from my point of view, maybe it wouldn't have made a big difference, but there had been a sequence of articles in the Psychological Review on avoidance, and one was by Bowles, another was by Herrnstein, I think there was one other as well. And at about that time, I then had been invited to write the chapter on avoidance in the Handbook of Operant Behavior. and that had, in figuring that out, it had taught me some things about even what behavior analytic theory is, but also how what's found in almost all of the textbooks is grossly inadequate, and yet there's a straightforward way of improving upon it. And so I was partway into an essay that had sort of taken the bare bones of that handbook chapter. The handbook chapter started out as the task was in part to catalog the recent work on avoidance, and so I don't know how many references there are, but probably a couple hundred. And in systematizing them, I found that actually I discovered that behavior analytic theory is in fact a theory that describes the environment as defined by its effects on behavior or by its interrelationships with behavior. And so I was writing something that would illustrate this and just use enough experiments to make the point rather than having the whole catalog there. Sort of 2/3 of the way through, and I got a phone call from Mike Zeiler, and he and Harzem were publishing a book, or were editing a book, and wanted to know if I wanted to contribute something on the topic of avoidance. Well, I'd certainly experienced some of the problems of getting things published in JM and certainly other journals as well, and so I couldn't be sure that my article would be accepted by Psych Review, but I'd been thinking in terms of Psych Review. Well, instead, I finished the article and published it in that book, which never was very widely distributed. And yet, I wished then that I had stuck with it and tried to publish it in Psych Review. Why? Because there'd be some chance then that contemporary textbooks today then would include a more viable account of avoidance. Right now, the standard textbook account of avoidance has been untenable since 1957. That is, there's an experiment by Sidman and Boren that really showed that the warning stimulus is not what people normally think of, and avoidance is not primarily reduction in fear, etc. We do a lot of avoiding without being afraid, and the warning stimulus is primarily a discriminative stimulus, and so on and so forth. I've published that argument in various other places, but I think it really needed to have been in that spot to have been influential, and maybe it still wouldn't have been, but I think that of any single thing, that's what I would have done differently. Other things, I always wish I'd done more writing than other things that I do. I used to be a very serious keyboard player, piano and harpsichord, and I found I used those as procrastination for writing, so actually I have hardly touched a keyboard in the last 15 years or so, but still I don't write as much as I should, and there are other colleagues who manage to do a lot of it. I suppose it's partly I do make myself more accessible to students than a lot of my colleagues do, and yet that I'm not sure that I should have given up, but time allocation, one can always wish one was better at it.
Do you have a specific writing schedule that you stick to?
I wish I did. There are certain times of year when I do. In the summer, we go up to Maine for about 6 weeks, and during that time, in most years, I've managed to write every morning, and that can be very productive. Then when I come back, I continue that as long as I can, but almost always there's a train wreck that occurs in October. There's just too much stuff, the promotion and tenure committee and this and that and the other thing. And also just the demands of the courses you're teaching heat up at that time. And so I've never been able to hold to that. Maybe if I could get up at 5 in the morning every day, it would work, but I've become less and less of a morning person as time passed. And so, there's one of those cases of relations between one's verbal behavior and other behavior. I know in principle, yes, you should write at the same time per day, and you should defend that against everything. Well, for me, if I write in the morning, if let's say I write up until 10 o'clock in the morning, that in fact for it to work well, I have to spend then about a half hour or a little more of transition time. So I'm really not then done until maybe 11. So, okay, I'm now ready to go into work and really am not there much till noon. Well, by that time, there will be things that have gotten screwed up because I wasn't there earlier. And so if I had been there at the time when the problem came up, it could have been dealt with in 5 minutes. But now, okay, something's come up, but now the person I have to meet to deal with it is already in a meeting or someplace else themselves, and so you end up spending a lot of extra time just because you weren't there in the morning. So I've not ever solved that problem quite, of how, if I firmly defend the writing time, I really pay for it extra at other times of the day. So that's still, it's a continual writing and time management. You know, all of us, I think, too, need to learn how to manage email time. I've managed it in some ways now, and what I do is I don't check email until I've finished a task. And sometimes the tasks are smaller, sometimes a little larger, although that still hasn't handled the problem of when do I clean out the mailbox, which currently has something like 1,000 messages in it.
So what message would you like to send students of the future?
Well, I think one thing is that behavior analysis in some ways has never been easy. And I think it was quite a long time ago that all the easy experiments had been done. So you have to start small, deal with the fact that it probably is always going to be countercultural in some ways, but you don't need to pick unnecessary arguments and fights with people from other viewpoints then. And yet at the same time, you should be looking for ways that engage them, identifying what common ground there is, and then constructively identifying differences to the extent that you can. I think to some degree it's the world of behavior analysis continues to improve in that when I was starting out, we didn't have email, we didn't have an ABA organization, we didn't have all the regional organizations, and so people were, in many cases, out there working by themselves in a somewhat hostile environment. Now, you have a network of people that you can stay in touch with almost effortlessly, and it's important that we come to these meetings. At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to become insular in a different way, in that right now you could spend all your travel time and travel money on going to behavioral meetings, because we have the various regional meetings, we have ABA itself, and so forth. And you could then, there are people out there who think that behavior analysis or Skinnerian psychology has disappeared because they don't see it. They didn't see it at EPA, they didn't see it at the Midwestern Association for Psychology, they don't see it at APA appreciably. And so we need to renew a presence in those organizations. I was elected president of EPA 2 years ago, and so I was able to get applied behavior analysis inserted onto the program as a category, and so I think that will help. But then we have to show up there, and we're working at that. Jerry Sertikov is actually now the program chair for EPA, so I think we're creating a renewed presence in the organization that was the place to be in the spring for behavior analysts at one time. JAB was founded at an EPA meeting, and so I think we need to spend time letting the world out there know who we are. I think the problem of autism and the rapid acceleration in its recognition as an important problem provides an opportunity for us because we are the people who can deal with that in terms of interventions. We don't want to become known just as the field of autism, and yet I'm now doing quite a bit of work that is involved in that. We can, on one hand, help a lot of families. On the other hand, we can learn a lot because in working with especially the severely impacted young child, you're really putting a person together, and things that normally happen easily, we can study because we have to make them happen, or they happen more slowly. At the same time, in working with an intervention for a child with autism, you're working with the presumably normal people who are carrying it out, and so you now have rule-governed behavior and some issues there. that enable you to actually do research as you do the work. Look for the important questions. I think one, and they're right before your eyes. The problem is how to recognize them. How do you generate new behavior? Well, traditionally you talked about shaping, etc. But sometimes we are not shaping behavior by successive approximations. In fact, there's a principle or a name for it now. Paul Andronis, I think, coined the term adduction or stimulus adduction. And that is where you teach component repertoires and then you provide the combined discriminative stimuli for them and select them as a new and larger entity, larger repertoire. Well, that's something that really bears working on. And we just, one of my students just recently provided a really exciting example of this with a child with autism. So that's one type of domain, finding and recognizing the, what are the really important issues. If a project or an experiment isn't working right, there's probably something going on that's more important than what you thought you were studying. And so I mean, that Pavlov was one of the first people to do that. When the guy with the white coat came in and the dog started slobbering, it screwed up what he was studying, but he recognized there was something else more important going on. Well, I think we have that kind of situation all the time. People following instructions is an important thing. Here's another one. Skinner suggested that instructed or rule-governed behavior is relatively insensitive to its direct consequences. Well, yes, a good example of that is military training. What it's about is you follow orders no matter what. That's irrespective of somebody shooting at you or whatever. Well, how about the ways we teach teachers? If we teach them to do this stuff on the basis of our supplying the consequences, doing what we say because we said it, etc., we may have desensitized the teacher to the child's progress being their reinforcer. We complain about teachers or about staff as being relatively unconcerned about whether their client or their student is improving. They're more concerned with this or that or the other thing. Well, maybe if we taught them to do what they're doing as rule-governed behavior, we ourselves desensitize them to what we say ought to be important to them. And so I think there are issues of that kind that are right there before our eyes, and I think those are things to look for. Yet to do a good experiment, you have to take a piece of it and try to figure out in a systematic way what's going on in a systematic